Imagine standing on the deck of the largest, most luxurious ship ever built, surrounded by thousands of people laughing, dining, believing they are aboard an unsinkable marvel of human engineering. Then, in an instant, everything changes. A distant scraping sound, a shudder beneath your feet, confusion. Then I panic. Within hours, over 1,500 people are gone, swallowed by the freezing Atlantic, but you survive.
Help us! Somebody help!
It's too cold, I can't move.
Get to the boat!
You make it into a lifeboat. You watch the ship split in half and disappear beneath the black water. You hear the screams fade into silence, and then, somehow, you are rescued. You return to land. You are called lucky, a survivor, a miracle. But here's the question nobody asks. What does it do to a person's mind to survive when so many others did not? What psychological weight do you carry when you were chosen by chance, by circumstance, by a split-second decision to live while others died? The survivors of the Titanic did not just escape death. They were forced to carry something far heavier, the unbearable awareness that their survival was random, that luck had no morality, and that the world they returned to could never understand what they had witnessed. This is not a story about heroism or tragedy. This is a story about the silent, invisible burden that survivors carry for the rest of their lives. A burden that changes how they see themselves, how they relate to others, and how they make sense of a world that allows such horror to exist. In the next 13 minutes, we are going to step inside the minds of those who survived the Titanic. We will explore the guilt, the nightmares, the isolation, and the strange, uncomfortable truth that survival is not always a gift. Sometimes it is a sentence. If you have ever felt guilty for being okay when others were not, if you have ever questioned why you were spared while others suffered, if you have ever felt like you do not deserve the peace you have, this video will speak to something deep inside you. And by the end, you will understand why the survivors of the Titanic were not just marked by what they escaped, but by what they could never leave behind. In the early hours of April 15, 1912, the RMS Titanic sank in the North Atlantic after striking an iceberg. Of the 2,224 passengers and crew aboard, only 710 survived. The physical details of the disaster are well known. The insufficient lifeboats, the freezing water, the chaos, the class divisions that determined who lived and who died. But what is rarely discussed is what happened inside the minds of those who made it out alive. Survivor's guilt is not a modern concept. It has existed for as long as humans have experienced tragedy. But the Titanic survivors were among the first in modern history to be studied, observed, and forced to publicly reconcile their survival with the deaths of so many others. Psychologists today understand survivor's guilt as a form of moral injury, a deep psychological wound that occurs when a person's sense of right and wrong is shattered by circumstances beyond their control. For the Titanic survivors, this injury began the moment they realized they were in a lifeboat while others were still on the ship. Many survivors reported an immediate, overwhelming sense of wrongness. They did not feel relief. They felt horror, because in that moment survival was not a triumph, it was a betrayal. The mind struggles to reconcile randomness with morality. We are wired to believe that good people are rewarded and bad people are punished. That effort leads to success. That care leads to safety. But the Titanic shattered that illusion completely. A mother who grabbed her children and ran to the lifeboat survived. Another mother, just as loving, just as desperate, did not make it in time. A young man who happened to be on the correct side of the ship when the lifeboats were being loaded survived. Another young man, equally deserving, equally innocent, stood 20 feet away and drowned. There was no logic, no fairness, no justice, just chaos, and the survivors were forced to live with that knowledge. One survivor, Charlotte Collier, described the guilt as suffocating. She later wrote, "I can still hear the cries of those in the water. I hear them in my sleep. I hear them when I am awake. I feel as though I should have done something, but I did not know what." This is the core of survivor's guilt, the irrational but unshakable belief that you could have, should have, done something differently. Even when logic says otherwise, the mind torments itself with endless variations of the same question. Why me? Why not them? What did I do to deserve this? Another survivor, Lawrence Beasley, a science teacher, wrote extensively about his experience. He described a strange emotional numbness that set in after the rescue. He said that for weeks he felt as though he were watching his own life from a distance, as though the person who survived was not really him, but some hollow version of himself. This dissociation is a common response to trauma. The mind, overwhelmed by horror it cannot process, creates distance. It separates the self from the experience as a protective measure. But this protection comes at a cost. Many Titanic survivors reported feeling disconnected from the people around them. They returned to families, to jobs, to routines, but nothing felt real. Conversations felt trivial. Daily concerns felt meaningless. How could they care about dinner plans or work deadlines when they had watched hundreds of people die? The gap between their internal reality and the external world became unbridgeable. They were back on land, but part of them never left the lifeboats. Psychologists today call this existential isolation. It is the realization that no one can truly understand your experience. No one can feel what you felt. No one can see what you saw. And so, even when surrounded by people, you are alone. The Titanic survivors lived in this isolation for the rest of their lives. Some tried to speak about it. Most found that words failed them. How do you explain the sound of 1,500 people dying in freezing water? How do you convey the weight of being alive when so many others are not? And here is the cruelest part: society did not make it easier. In the months and years following the disaster, survivors were questioned, judged, and even blamed. Male survivors, especially those from first class, faced public scrutiny. Why did you survive when women and children died? Did you push someone aside? Did you take a seat that was not yours? The accusations were rarely based on evidence. They were based on collective discomfort with the randomness of tragedy. People needed someone to blame, and survivors, simply by being alive, became targets. J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, survived the sinking. He was vilified in the press, accused of cowardice, and labeled a disgrace. For the rest of his life, he lived in isolation, haunted by public condemnation and his own guilt. He rarely spoke about the Titanic. He avoided social gatherings. He became a shadow. This is what survivor's guilt does. It does not just haunt you privately. It reshapes your entire identity. Ask yourself this: if you survived a disaster where others died, would you feel worthy of the life you have? Would you allow yourself to be happy? Or would you spend the rest of your days trying to justify your existence, trying to prove that your survival was not a mistake? Most Titanic survivors never fully reconciled with their survival. They carried the weight silently because society offered them no framework to process it. But the psychological impact did not stop at guilt. It extended into something even more insidious: hypervigilance, distrust of safety, and the collapse of the illusion of control. Before the Titanic, the world believed in progress, in engineering, in human mastery over nature. The ship was marketed as unsinkable. It represented the pinnacle of modern achievement. And then it sank on its maiden voyage. For the survivors, this was not just a tragedy. It was a betrayal of reality itself. If the unsinkable could sink, what else was a lie? If the most advanced ship in the world could be destroyed by a piece of ice, what safety could ever be trusted? The survivors returned to a world where nothing felt secure. Every structure, every promise, every assurance carried the shadow of doubt. Many survivors developed severe anxiety. They refused to board ships again. Some became obsessed with safety, checking and rechecking every detail of their lives, trying to impose control where none existed. This is a hallmark of post-traumatic stress. The mind, having experienced catastrophic failure of safety, becomes hypersensitive to danger. It scans constantly for threats. It trusts nothing. It expects disaster at any moment. One survivor, Eva Hart, was only 7 years old when the Titanic sank. She lost her father in the disaster. For the rest of her life, she refused to travel by ship. She described a recurring nightmare in which she was back on the Titanic, searching for her father, knowing he was gone but unable to stop looking. This is the prison of trauma. The past does not stay in the past. It intrudes, uninvited, into every moment of the present. Another survivor, Edith Russell, carried a small toy pig with her into the lifeboat. It played music when wound up. She later said that the toy became a talisman, a symbol of survival, but also a reminder of everything she lost. She kept it for the rest of her life, unable to let it go, unable to explain why. Trauma attaches meaning to objects, to moments, to sensations in ways that defy logic. The mind creates anchors in an attempt to make sense of chaos. But perhaps the most profound psychological impact was the survivors' relationship with guilt over joy. Many reported an inability to experience happiness without feeling shame. How could they laugh when so many had died? How could they celebrate life when their survival felt undeserved? This is not rational, but trauma is not rational. It operates on a deeper, more primal level. Survivor's guilt is not about actual responsibility. It is about the mind's desperate attempt to impose meaning on randomness. If you believe you could have done something, then at least a tragedy makes sense. If you accept that you were simply lucky, then you must also accept that the universe is indifferent, that death is arbitrary, and that control is an illusion. That realization is unbearable, and so the mind chooses guilt, because guilt, at least, gives the tragedy meaning. The survivors of the Titanic were not broken people. They were ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances, but those circumstances changed them in ways that never fully healed. They returned to the world, but the world they returned to was not the same, and neither were they. So what does this mean for us? Why does the psychology of the Titanic survivors still matter over a century later? Because the patterns they experienced, the guilt, the isolation, the hypervigilance, the collapse of safety, these are universal responses to trauma. They are not unique to shipwrecks or disasters at sea. They exist in anyone who has survived what others did not, in anyone who has been spared while others suffered, in anyone who carries the invisible weight of simply being alive. If you have ever felt guilty for your happiness, for your success, for your peace, you are not alone. If you have ever questioned whether you deserve what you have, you are carrying the same burden the Titanic survivors carried. And understanding that burden is the first step toward compassion, not just for them, but for yourself. The survivors of the Titanic teach us something profound, that survival is not always a gift. Sometimes it is a burden, and the true measure of a life is not whether you survived, but what you do with the weight you carry afterward. If this video resonated with you, take a moment to reflect. What are you carrying that no one sees? What guilt, what weight, what invisible burden shapes how you move through the world? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. Your reflection may help someone else feel less alone. And if you want to continue exploring the hidden psychology of history, subscribe to this channel. Because the past is not just a collection of events, it is a mirror. And when we look closely, we see ourselves reflected in the eyes of those who came before us. The survivors of the Titanic did not just survive a shipwreck. They survived the collapse of certainty itself. And in that survival, they discovered a truth that we all must eventually face, that life is fragile, that safety is an illusion, and that the only way forward is to carry the weight with grace, with honesty, and with the quiet courage to keep living anyway.